The chapel doors slammed shut in Grace Hartwell's face, with a sound like a gunshot echoing across the Oklahoma plains. This was the moment a young widow learned that grief has an expiration date in small towns, and hers had run out. Grace stood on the wooden steps of First Baptist Church in Mercy, Oklahoma, her 5-year-old son Thomas clinging to her black skirts. The November wind of 1919 carried the smell of dry wheat and coming snow, biting through the thin fabric of her mourning dress. She'd worn black for 3 years since the telegram arrived, the one that said her husband Daniel had fallen at the Somme. 3 years of scraping by on a war widow's pittance. 3 years of whispers and sidelong glances. 3 years of watching Thomas grow hungrier and paler in their rented room above the grain store. She'd finally agreed to marry Howard Mitchell, the bank clerk who'd been courting her with awkward persistence for 8 months. Not for love. She was honest enough to admit that. But for survival. For Thomas. For the simple ability to put meat on the table more than once a week. But the town of Mercy had other ideas about what a proper widow should do. "You heard Pastor Whitmore," Howard said from behind her, his voice thin and apologetic. "He says it ain't proper. Says you're still touched by death, bringing bad luck wherever you go." Grace turned slowly. Howard stood 5 steps below her, hat in hand, unable to meet her eyes. Beyond him, a cluster of townspeople had gathered. Mrs. Greenfield from the general store, old Mr. Carson who ran the feed supply, the bishops who owned half the county, all watching, all waiting to see what the cursed widow would do. "Howard, we had an agreement," Grace said quietly. "Thomas needs—" "I can't marry cursed goods, Grace. You understand." Howard's face reddened. "3 men who courted you before me all had misfortune. Jenkins lost his leg in a threshing accident. Paulson's barn burned. Even those were coincidences. That's what they all say before the next tragedy strikes." He backed down another step. "I got my own future to think about. My own family name." Thomas pressed harder against his mother's leg. Grace felt him trembling, whether from cold or fear, she couldn't tell. She placed a hand on his wheat-colored hair, the exact shade Daniel's had been. Behind her, the church door opened a crack. Pastor Whitmore's angular face appeared, his expression a mixture of pity and disgust. "Mrs. Hartwell, I must ask you to leave the church grounds. Your presence is disturbing the congregation. We have standards to uphold, and a woman who—" The crack of a rifle shot split the November air. Every head turned toward the road, where a dusty automobile had backfired and rolled to a stop. The driver's door opened, and a man climbed out, slowly, painfully, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. He wore a mud-stained army uniform, the jacket hanging loose on a frame that had once been broader. A livid scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, and his right leg dragged as he walked. Grace's breath caught. She knew that walk, knew those shoulders even diminished by suffering. "James." The name escaped her lips as barely a whisper. James Patrick Reilly limped up the church steps, his blue eyes, the same eyes that had laughed with Daniel around 1,000 childhood campfires, fixed on Pastor Whitmore with an intensity that made the preacher step backward. "I believe," James said, his voice carrying across the churchyard with the authority of a man who'd given orders under artillery fire, "that there's a wedding about to take place here." Grace's world tilted. James Reilly had been Daniel's closest friend since boyhood. They'd enlisted together, shipped out together, fought together in the muddy hell of France. The last letter she'd received from Daniel, dated 2 weeks before his death, had mentioned James. Tell Grace that if anything happens to me, Jamie will look after her. He promised. Brothers take care of brothers' families. She'd assumed James had died too. No letter had come. No word. And now here he stood, 3 years later, like a ghost made flesh. "Mr. Reilly," Pastor Whitmore sputtered, "this is a private church matter. I don't know what you think you're—" "Daniel Hartwell saved my life at Belleau Wood," James said, his voice dropping but somehow growing harder. "Took a bullet meant for me. Died 3 days later in a field hospital while I held his hand." He turned his gaze to Grace, and in his eyes she saw years of pain, guilt, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Before he died, he made me promise. If he didn't come home, I was to make sure his family was cared for, that his boy grew up safe, that Grace never had to stand alone." The churchyard had gone silent. James climbed the remaining steps, each one clearly costing him effort. When he reached Grace's level, he extended his hand to her, scarred, trembling slightly, but steady in its purpose. "I'm 3 years late keeping my promise," he said softly. "But I'm here now, and if you'll have me, Grace Hartwell, I'd like to make good on the word I gave your husband." Grace stared at the offered hand, her mind reeling. Was James Reilly proposing marriage? Before we go further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you're invested in Grace's story, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. Because what Grace didn't know yet was that James had been carrying more than a promise across 3,000 miles and 3 long years. He'd been carrying a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about the day Daniel died. Grace's hand trembled as it met James's calloused palm, and the touch sent a shock of recognition through her bones. This was real, not a fever dream born of desperation. The question burning in everyone's mind was simple. Would the cursed widow accept a proposal from a broken soldier, or would she condemn him to the same misfortune that had supposedly claimed every man who'd come near her? James's grip was warm despite the November chill, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the churchyard with quiet conviction. "Pastor Whitmore, I'm here to marry Grace Hartwell. Today. Now. And I'd appreciate it if you'd perform the ceremony as originally planned." The pastor's face purpled. "Young man, I don't care what promises you made in some foreign trench. This woman has brought nothing but misfortune to this town. 3 suitors have suffered calamities. Her very presence—" "Her presence," James interrupted, his voice hardening to flint, "is that of a war widow who's raised a boy alone on pennies while grown men whispered superstitions instead of offering help." He didn't release Grace's hand. "I've seen real curses, Pastor. Seen men blown apart by shells. Seen poison gas turn lungs to liquid. Seen things that would make your Sunday sermons sound like bedtime stories." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Grace Hartwell isn't cursed. She's just been abandoned by people who should have known better." Thomas peered around his mother's skirts, his wide eyes fixed on the tall soldier. "Are you my papa's friend? The one from the letters?" James's expression softened completely. He released Grace's hand and lowered himself painfully to one knee, bringing his scarred face level with the boy's. "I am, son. Your papa and I grew up together. Climbed every tree in Mercy County. Got in more trouble than 2 boys had any right to survive." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He talked about you every day. Said you were going to be tall and strong and smart. Looks like he was right on all counts." "Did my papa hurt?" Thomas asked with the brutal honesty of children. The question hung in the cold air. Grace felt her throat tighten, waiting for the polite lie, the gentle deflection. Instead, James met the boy's eyes and said, "Not at the end. I made sure of that. And the last thing he said was your name, and your mama's name, and that he loved you both more than all the stars in France." Thomas reached out and touched the scar on James's face with one small finger. "Did that hurt?" "Like the devil. Still does on cold days." James didn't flinch from the child's touch. "But I'm here, and that's what matters. Your papa made sure I got home. Now I'm going to make sure you and your mama are taken care of. That's what brothers do." Grace felt something crack open in her chest, the hard shell she'd built around her heart to survive 3 years of poverty and scorn. She'd been so focused on survival, on finding any harbor in the storm, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, not as a burden or a superstition, but as a person worthy of protection. "This is absurd." Howard Mitchell's voice cut through the moment. He'd climbed the steps, his face red with indignation. "Grace, you were going to marry me. We had an arrangement. I was willing to overlook your history. And now you're going to throw that away for some crippled soldier who shows up spouting romantic nonsense." James rose slowly, using his cane for leverage. When he stood at his full height, he topped Howard by half a head. "Were you willing to overlook her history, Mr. Mitchell? Or were you backing out of that arrangement about 30 seconds before I arrived?" Howard's mouth worked silently. "That's what I thought." James turned back to Pastor Whitmore. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to open that church door. You're going to perform a marriage ceremony. And you're going to do it with grace and dignity, because that's what a man of God is supposed to do." His voice dropped. "Or I'm going to stand right here on these steps and tell everyone gathered exactly what I saw in France, exactly what real evil looks like. And then I'm going to ask them which is worse, a widow trying to survive, or a town that turned its back on a soldier's family." A woman's voice called from the crowd. "Let them marry, Pastor." Grace recognized Mrs. Chen, who ran the small Chinese laundry on 4th Street. She'd always been kind to Grace, always slipped an extra penny's worth of soap when no one was looking. "The boy needs a father," another voice added. Mr. Kowalski, the Polish carpenter who'd lost his own son in the Argonne. "Soldier kept his promise," said old Samuel, the black man who maintained the church grounds and whom Pastor Whitmore barely acknowledged. "That's worth something." Pastor Whitmore looked at the gathering crowd, at the soldiers and immigrants and working people who rarely spoke up in church matters. His authority was slipping, and Grace could see him calculating, weighing his options. "Very well," he said tightly. "But I want it noted that I perform this ceremony under protest, and any misfortune that follows will be yours to explain to God," James finished. "Now open the door." The pastor stepped aside. James offered his arm to Grace. She took it, feeling the corded strength beneath the worn uniform jacket, feeling the slight tremor that spoke of old wounds and persistent pain. Thomas gripped her other hand. Together, they walked through the church doors. The interior smelled of beeswax and old hymn books, dust motes dancing in the colored light from the stained glass windows. Grace had been married here once before, 7 years ago, in a ceremony filled with flowers and music and hope. Daniel had been so young then, both of them barely 20, convinced that love was enough to build a life on. She'd been wrong about that, but she'd learned. This time, there were no flowers, no music, just a scarred soldier, a hungry child, and a widow in black walking toward an altar while a handful of witnesses filed in behind them. But as James squeezed her hand gently, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in 3 long years. Hope. What she didn't know was that James's reasons for marrying her went deeper than a deathbed promise, and the truth would either bind them together or tear them apart forever. The vows were spoken in Pastor Whitmore's coldest voice, each word dropping like stones into still water, but Grace barely heard them over the thundering of her own heart. What mattered wasn't the pastor's blessing, but the look in James Reilly's eyes as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a look that held too much knowledge, too much unspoken history. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. No one threw rice. No one offered congratulations. The witnesses, Mrs. Chen, Mr. Kowalski, old Samuel, and a handful of others, nodded solemnly as Grace and James signed the registry. Thomas stood between them, one small hand clutching his mother's skirt, the other reaching up to hold James's calloused palm. "You may kiss the bride," Pastor Whitmore said with audible distaste. James leaned down, and Grace tilted her face up, expecting a chaste brush of lips. Instead, he paused a breath away and whispered so only she could hear, "I need to tell you something. About Daniel. About why he really sent me." Then his lips touched hers, brief, warm, carrying the weight of secrets. They walked out of First Baptist Church as husband and wife into the pale November sunlight. Howard Mitchell had vanished. Most of the original crowd had dispersed, though a few lingered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly concealed disapproval. James's automobile sat by the road, a battered Ford Model T that had seen better days. He opened the passenger door for Grace and Thomas, his movements stiff but practiced. As Grace settled into the seat with Thomas on her lap, she noticed something on the dashboard, a small photograph in a tarnished frame. Daniel's face smiled up at her, young and whole, his arm around James's shoulders. Both boys, for they'd been barely more than boys, grinned at the camera with the invincibility of youth. The photo was creased and water-stained, carried through mud and blood and 3 years of war. "Where are we going?" Grace asked as James climbed behind the wheel. "My place." "Well, our place now." He started the engine, which coughed and rattled before catching. "It's not much. 40 acres outside town that my uncle left me. House needs work, but it's got a roof and a wood stove and enough land to grow food." Thomas's eyes widened. "A real house? With a yard?" "Big enough to run in," James confirmed. "And there's a creek where your papa and I used to catch crawdads when we were your age." They drove through Mercy in silence, past the grain store where Grace had spent 3 years in a cramped room, past the bank where Howard Mitchell probably sat counting other people's money, past the general store where Mrs. Greenfield would already be spreading news of the scandalous wedding. The town gave way to open prairie, golden grass bending under the wind, the sky so vast and blue it hurt to look at. Grace had forgotten how beautiful Oklahoma could be when you weren't viewing it through the lens of grief and poverty. James's property sat at the end of a rutted dirt road. The house was small, weathered wood, sagging porch, windows that needed new glass, but Grace had lived in worse. A barn stood behind it, listing slightly but standing. Chickens pecked in a yard that showed signs of recent tending. "It's perfect," Grace said, and meant it. James killed the engine and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Grace, before we go inside, before this goes any further, I need to tell you the truth. the whole truth about Daniel's last days. Thomas had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, exhausted by the morning's emotions. Grace stroked his hair, her eyes on James's scarred profile. "I thought you said he didn't suffer." "He didn't. Not physically." James's knuckles were white on the wheel. "But there's more to the story. More than I told you in the letters. More than I could tell you with the whole town watching." Grace's stomach tightened. "Tell me now." James turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw 3 years of carried guilt. "Daniel didn't just save me at Belleau Wood. He saved 23 men that day. When our position got overrun, when the Germans were cutting through our lines, Daniel held a choke point alone while the rest of us retreated to regroup." His voice roughened. "He took 7 bullets, Grace. 7. And he stayed standing until every man was clear." "I know he was a hero," Grace said softly. "The army sent a letter. The letter didn't tell you what he said while I held him afterward." James's jaw worked. "Didn't tell you that he was conscious for 3 days in that hospital. 3 days where he made me promise things. Not just to look after you and Thomas." He paused. "He made me promise to tell you the truth about why he enlisted." The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them and the sleeping child between them. "What truth?" "Daniel didn't enlist because of patriotism or adventure. He enlisted because the bank was going to foreclose on his father's farm. Because Howard Mitchell, yes, that Howard Mitchell, offered to delay the foreclosure if Daniel signed up and took the enlistment bonus. Used that bonus to make a payment." James's voice turned bitter. "Howard told him it was temporary, that the war would be short, that he'd be home in 6 months with a hero's welcome and enough saved to pay off the farm entirely." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Howard Mitchell sent Daniel to war. For money. For profit. Howard's been doing it to 6 families in the county. Offers deals to desperate men, then forecloses anyway while they're overseas. That farm? The one Daniel died trying to save? Howard took it 2 years ago. Sold it to a cattle company out of Tulsa. The rage that swept through Grace was white-hot and clarifying. Every moment of Howard's awkward courtship, every stammered proposal, every promise of security, all of it recontextualized in an instant. He hadn't been trying to rescue her. He'd been trying to absolve himself, trying to smooth over the guilt of sending her husband to die. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked through clenched teeth. "Because I only got back to Oklahoma 6 weeks ago. Spent 2 years in Army hospitals, Grace. 6 surgeries to save my leg. Another year trying to put my head back together after what I'd seen." He touched the scar on his face unconsciously. "When I finally made it to Mercy, the first thing I did was track you down. Found out you were planning to marry the man who killed your husband." Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what she'd missed in the chaos of the morning. The hollows in his cheeks, the way his uniform hung on a frame that had lost 30 pounds, the white-knuckled grip he maintained on everything, as if letting go would mean falling apart entirely. "You could have just told me," she said. "You didn't have to marry me." "Yes, I did." James's voice was raw. "Because a promise to a dying man is a sacred thing. Because Daniel was more than my friend. He was my brother in every way that mattered. And because—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Because I loved him, Grace. Not the way you did, but I loved him. And I failed him." "How did you fail him?" "I should have been the one holding that position. Should have been the one taking those bullets. I was the better shot, the faster runner." But Daniel pushed me aside and took my place because he knew I didn't have anyone waiting at home, knew I was alone in the world. Tears tracked down James's scarred face. He died so I could live, and I've spent 3 years trying to figure out how to make that mean something. Grace reached across the space between them and took his face in her hands, the way she'd once done with Daniel when nightmares woke him. James Reilly, listen to me. You didn't fail him. You came back. You kept your promise. You stood on those church steps and faced down a town's worth of hatred to protect his family. She wiped his tears with her thumbs. That's not failure. That's love. Thomas stirred against her shoulder, mumbling in his sleep. Papa? No, sweetheart, Grace whispered. It's James. It's your new papa. James's breath hitched at the word. They sat in that battered Ford for a long moment. 3 people bound together by loss and loyalty and the fierce determination to build something good from the wreckage of war. But neither Grace nor James knew that Howard Mitchell was already planning his revenge, and that by nightfall, their fragile new family would face its first real test. The house smelled of linseed oil and fresh bread, and Grace realized James had been preparing for their arrival long before he'd driven to that church. The question was no longer whether they could survive together, but whether they could forge something real from the ashes of grief and duty. Inside, the small farmhouse revealed James's efforts. The floors had been scrubbed clean. Firewood was stacked neatly beside a potbelly stove that radiated warmth. A kitchen table, scarred but sturdy, held 3 place settings and a pot of stew that filled the air with the scent of beef and vegetables. In the corner, a child's bed had been assembled. The frame new, the quilt obviously handmade if somewhat clumsily stitched. You made this? Grace asked, running her hand over the uneven stitches. James's ears reddened. Mrs. Chen tried to teach me. I'm better with a rifle than a needle, but I wanted Thomas to have something of his own. He set down his cane and ladled stew into bowls with hands that shook slightly. There's only 1 bedroom. I've been sleeping in the barn. I can continue. James. Grace's voice was firm. We're married. I won't have you sleeping in a barn on your wedding night, bad leg and all. She saw him tense and added quickly, There's a couch near the stove. You'll take that. I'll take the bedroom with Thomas until we figure out what this is. The relief in his face was palpable. He'd been expecting demands, expectations, the conjugal rights that marriage supposedly guaranteed. Instead, Grace was offering him the same thing he'd offered her. Time. They ate in comfortable silence. Thomas wedged between them, devouring his stew with the single-minded focus of a child who'd gone hungry too often. Grace watched James watch the boy, saw the tender way he made sure Thomas's bowl stayed full, saw him smile when Thomas told a rambling story about a dog he'd seen in town. This was what Daniel had wanted, she realized. Not a marriage of passion, but one of protection, of family. After dinner, James showed Thomas the chickens, 6 hens and a rooster who strutted with comical importance. The boy's laughter rang across the yard, clear and bright, and Grace felt something loosen in her chest. When had Thomas last laughed like that? As darkness fell, they settled into an evening routine that felt both strange and natural. Grace washed dishes while James read to Thomas from a battered copy of Treasure Island, his deep voice bringing Long John Silver to life. The boy's eyes grew heavy, fighting sleep, reluctant to let this perfect day end. Time for bed, sweetheart, Grace said, lifting him. Will James be here in the morning? Thomas asked, suddenly fearful. I will, James promised. Every morning from now on. Grace tucked Thomas into his new bed, kissed his forehead, and listened as his breathing evened into sleep. When she returned to the main room, James was banking the fire, moving stiffly, his bad leg clearly paining him after the long day. "Sit," she commanded gently. "Let me look at that leg." "Grace, you don't have to." "James Reilly, I've been nursing my own wounds and my son's for 3 years. I know my way around injuries. Now sit." He obeyed, lowering himself onto the couch with a barely suppressed wince. Grace knelt beside him, her hands steady as she rolled up his trouser leg. The scarring was extensive, surgery lines crisscrossing the calf, areas where muscle had been torn away and hadn't grown back properly. It was the leg of a man who'd been told he'd never walk again and had proven the doctors wrong through sheer stubbornness. "Does it hurt all the time?" she asked, her fingers gentle as she probed for inflammation. "Only when I'm awake." The attempt at humor fell flat. "The doctors said I was lucky. Shrapnel missed the main artery by a 1/4 inch, but the bone was shattered. They put it back together with pins and prayers." Grace retrieved a tin of salve from her bag, precious stuff she'd been hoarding for Thomas's occasional scrapes. She worked it into James's scarred skin with firm, sure strokes, feeling the tension gradually leave his muscles. "Why did you really marry me, James?" The question emerged softer than she'd intended. "The truth. Not the promise to Daniel. Not the heroic gesture. Why?" His hand covered hers, stilling her movements. In the firelight, his scarred face looked younger, more vulnerable. "Because when I was lying in that hospital in France, dying a dozen times over, you know what kept me alive? The letters Daniel read me. Your letters." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The way you described Thomas's first steps. The way you wrote about the garden you were trying to grow. The way you saw beauty in ordinary things. A sunrise, a bird's nest. The way light came through the kitchen window." He met her eyes. "I fell in love with the woman in those letters, with her strength and her hope and her refusal to give up even when everything was falling apart." Grace's breath caught. "I know that's not what you want to hear," James continued. "I know you married me for survival, for Thomas, for practical reasons. And that's fine. That's enough. I'm not asking for anything more than—" She kissed him. It wasn't like the chaste kiss in the church. This was deliberate, honest, the kiss of a woman who'd just realized that survival and hope weren't mutually exclusive, that perhaps she could have both. When they broke apart, James looked dazed. "Grace, I'm not promising love," she said firmly. "Not yet. I loved Daniel, and that love is still in my bones. But I'm promising honesty, and the honest truth is that you're the first person in 3 years who's seen me as something other than a burden or a curse or a problem to be solved." She cupped his scarred face. "So we'll take this slow. We'll figure it out together. One day at a time." "One day at a time," he echoed. They sat together on that couch as the fire burned low, not speaking, just existing in each other's presence. Grace's head found his shoulder. His arm circled her waist. And for the first time in 3 years, Grace Hartwell, Grace Reilly now, felt safe. Outside, the Oklahoma wind whispered through the wheat fields, carrying the scent of coming winter. And on the road to town, Howard Mitchell sat in his automobile with a bottle of whiskey and a head full of rage, planning exactly how he was going to make the war widow and her crippled soldier pay for humiliating him. Justice, he told himself, was sometimes a man's job to deliver. The sound of breaking glass shattered the pre-dawn silence. followed by the acrid smell of kerosene soaking into wood. The escalation from whispered curses to outright violence had taken less than 12 hours, and now Grace's fragile new family faced a threat that would test whether James Reilly's war-honed instincts could protect them in peacetime. Grace jolted awake to James's hand clamping over her mouth. He'd moved from the couch to her doorway with the silent efficiency of a soldier who'd learned that noise meant death. His finger pressed to his lips in the universal signal for silence. "Someone's outside," he whispered. "Stay with Thomas. Don't light a lamp." Through the bedroom window, Grace could see flickering orange light, a torch being carried around the perimeter of the house. Then voices, low and male, emboldened by darkness and alcohol. "Should have stayed in your widow's weeds, Grace Hartwell. Cursed woman, cursed house. Mitchell says they got what's coming." Grace's blood turned to ice. She gathered Thomas, still blessedly asleep, into her arms and crept to the doorway where James stood, his body coiled tight as a spring. In his hand was a revolver she hadn't known he owned. "How many?" she breathed. "3, maybe 4. Town boys playing at vigilante." His jaw was set. "Stay in the bedroom. If I tell you to run, you take Thomas out the back window and head for the Chen's place. Don't stop. Don't look back." "James!" Another crash of glass. The kitchen window this time. The smell of kerosene intensified. They were going to burn the house down, with her and Thomas inside. James moved to the front door with the predator's grace of a man who'd hunted and been hunted in France's killing fields. He threw the door open and fired a single shot into the air, the report deafening in the confined space. "Next bullet goes in flesh, not sky," he announced, his voice carrying the cold authority of an officer addressing troops. "I suggest you boys go home before your mothers find out you've been playing with matches." A long silence, then nervous laughter from the darkness. "You can't shoot all of us, cripple." "Don't need to shoot all of you, just need to shoot one. And I never miss." James stepped onto the porch, silhouetted against the doorway. "I killed 17 men in France, some up close, some from a distance. Every single one is burned into my memory. You really want to be number 18? The casual mention of killing, delivered without bravado or shame, just flat statement of fact, had the desired effect. Grace heard scuffling, muttered arguments. "Mitchell said you wouldn't fight back," a younger voice called. "Said you were too broken up from the war." "Howard Mitchell is a coward who sends other men to do his dirty work," James replied. "Same way he sent Daniel Hartwell to die in France while he stayed safe counting money. You boys know that? Know that your banker profits off sending men to war?" More silence. Grace could almost hear the mental calculations happening in the darkness, weighing loyalty to Mitchell against the uncomfortable truth of James's words. "That ain't true," someone said, but with less conviction. "It's documented. Bank records, enlistment bonuses, foreclosure dates, all of it lined up neat as a ledger." James lowered his gun slightly, a calculated gesture of trust. "You boys are from town. I recognize your voices, Bobby Greenfield, that you? And Tommy Carson? Your fathers know you're out here terrorizing a woman and a 5-year-old child?" A torch dropped to the ground, sputtering out in the dirt. "We was just trying to scare you," Bobby Greenfield said, his bravado crumbling. "Mitchell said it'd be a prank, nothing serious. Said the cursed widow needed to learn her place. And burning down a house with a child inside is a prank?" Grace stepped out beside James, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear. "Bobby, I bought penny candy from your mother last week. Tommy, I mended your father's coat for free when he couldn't afford to pay. Is this how mercy treats its own? She heard someone, Tommy, probably, make a choked sound that might have been a sob. We're sorry, Mrs. Hartwell. Mrs. Reilly, we didn't think. No, you didn't think. You listened to a man whose pride got wounded and let him turn you into arsonists. James's voice softened marginally. Go home. Sleep off the whiskey. And tomorrow, you're going to have some hard conversations with your families about what kind of men you want to be. The sound of retreating footsteps. The rumble of an automobile starting. Within minutes, the yard was empty except for the dropped torch and the lingering smell of kerosene. James sagged against the doorframe, his bad leg finally giving out. Grace caught him, bearing his weight, guiding him back to the couch. His hands were trembling, not from fear, she realized, but from the adrenaline crash that came after violence avoided. I'm sorry, he whispered. I brought this on you. Should have known Mitchell wouldn't let it go. You saved us. Grace cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. You saved Thomas. You saved me. That's all that matters. But as she held him, as she felt the rapid hammer of his heart against her palm, Grace understood with crystalline clarity that this wasn't over. Howard Mitchell had tried once. He would try again. And next time, he'd be more careful, more vicious. They needed to end this permanently. As dawn broke over the Oklahoma plains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Grace made a decision. She'd spent 3 years being passive, accepting her fate, letting the world happen to her. No more. If Howard Mitchell wanted a war, she'd give him one. But first, she needed to know exactly what she was fighting. And that meant going through every document, every letter, every piece of evidence that connected Mitchell to Daniel's death and the ruin of other families. James had said the proof existed. Now Grace was going to find it. And when she did, she was going to make sure that justice, real justice, not the vigilante kind that showed up drunk at midnight, was finally served. What would you do if the system that was supposed to protect you had been corrupted by the very man who'd destroyed your life? Grace found the evidence tucked inside a water-stained Bible in James's footlocker, hidden beneath his uniform and a Purple Heart he'd never mentioned earning. The confrontation Grace was building toward wouldn't happen in shadows or midnight raids, but in broad daylight, where the whole town could bear witness to the truth. The ledger was small, leather-bound, its pages filled with Daniel's precise handwriting. Grace recognized it immediately, the journal he'd kept during the war, the one she'd assumed had been lost with his personal effects. Her hands shook as she opened it, James standing behind her in the cold morning light, Thomas still sleeping in the next room. He gave it to me the night before he died, James said quietly. Told me to keep it safe. Said it contained everything anyone would need to know about Howard Mitchell's schemes. The entries started innocently enough. Observations about training camp, descriptions of the ocean crossing, the strange beauty of France despite the war. But by the 3rd month, Daniel's writing had changed, grown harder, angrier. March 12th, 1918. Received letter from Grace. Bank foreclosed on father's farm despite my payments. Mitchell claims I was delinquent. But I have receipts. I sent every dollar of my bonus plus half my pay each month. Where did the money go? Grace's vision blurred. She'd never known. Daniel had never told her he was still trying to save the farm, had never burdened her with that knowledge while she struggled alone with Thomas. She turned pages, reading entry after entry of her dead husband, piecing together a pattern. Other soldiers in his unit, farm boys from Oklahoma and Kansas and Missouri, all with similar stories. Enlistment bonuses that were supposed to save their land. Payments that mysteriously never reached the banks. Foreclosures that happened while they were in trenches, unable to defend their property. He documented 12 families, James said. 12 men who enlisted to save their farms and came home, if they came home at all, to find everything gone. Mitchell bought up the foreclosed properties through a shell company, sold them for 3 times what the families owed. May 4th, 1918. Jimmy Kowalski killed today. Shrapnel. He was carrying a letter from his wife. Bank took their house. He died not knowing his family was living in a chicken coop on the charity of neighbors. I'm starting to think Mitchell wants us dead. Easier than us coming home and asking questions. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. This was the man she'd married. Not just a hero who'd saved soldiers, but a man who'd seen injustice and documented it, who'd carried the weight of 12 families suffering, even as he faced death daily. There's more, James said gently, turning to the final entries. June 1st, 1918. Wrote everything out clearly, names, dates, amounts. If anything happens to me, Jamie will get this home. We'll make sure Grace knows. Make sure someone holds Mitchell accountable. A man who profits from war while braver men die. That's not business. That's blood money. June 14th, 1918. Final entry. We're moving up to hold Belleau Wood tomorrow. They say it'll be hell. But I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying without making this right. Grace, if you read this, and I hope you never have to, know that I loved you. I loved Thomas, and I'm sorry I couldn't save the farm. But maybe I can save other families from the same fate. Jamie promised. He'll help you finish this. The journal ended there, 3 days before Daniel took 7 bullets holding a choke point. Grace closed the book with trembling hands and looked at James. Why didn't you show me this immediately? Because I wasn't ready to watch you break when you realized how much Daniel was carrying, how much he was fighting for, even over there. James's voice was rough. And because I needed to verify everything first, spent the last 6 weeks going through county records, talking to the families Daniel mentioned. Every word in that journal is true, Grace. Every single word. Then we go to the sheriff. Sheriff Carson's nephew was one of the boys here last night. He's in Mitchell's pocket. The newspaper? Editor's biggest advertiser is First National Bank. Grace stood, pacing the small room, her mind working through possibilities. The system was rigged. The people who should have helped were compromised or complicit. This was what corruption looked like. Not dramatic or obvious, but woven into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that challenging it seemed impossible. But impossible wasn't the same as wrong. Church, she said suddenly. We go to the church, Sunday service when everyone's gathered. We stand up and we read from this journal in front of the whole congregation. We name names. We tell the truth where it can't be hidden or suppressed. James stared at her. Grace, that's... Pastor Whitmore will never allow it. Pastor Whitmore doesn't have to allow it. The doors are open. Anyone can walk in. She met his eyes. You said Daniel saved 23 men. How many of them came home? How many are still alive in this county? Understanding dawned on James's face. 7. 7 came home. Then we invite them. We invite the families of the men who didn't come home. We invite everyone Daniel tried to save. Grace's voice strengthened with each word. And we let Mitchell sit in his usual pew and hear exactly what he is, a man who built his fortune on soldiers' graves. Thomas appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mama, why are you crying?" Grace knelt and pulled her son into her arms. "Because I just learned how brave your papa was, and how lucky we are to have James helping us finish your papa's work." "What work?" "Making sure bad people face consequences for their actions." She kissed his forehead. "And teaching you that sometimes doing the right thing means standing up even when you're scared." The next 2 days passed in quiet preparation. James contacted the surviving soldiers, men scattered across the county, some farming, some working in town, all carrying the weight of what they'd seen and survived. Grace visited the families of the fallen, bringing Daniel's journal, showing them their sons' and husbands' and brothers' names, written in testimony to injustice. By Saturday evening, 23 people had promised to attend Sunday service at First Baptist Church. 23 witnesses to the truth. Howard Mitchell had no idea what was coming. But Grace knew that confronting him publicly was only half the battle. The harder part would be making sure the town actually listened, actually cared enough to act. Because what good was truth if no one was willing to defend it? The morning of November 23, 1919 dawned cold and clear, the kind of day where sound carried for miles across the prairie, and Grace Hartwell Reilly walked into First Baptist Church with a dead man's journal clutched to her chest. This was the moment when a town would decide whether it valued comfortable lies or uncomfortable truths, and whether the widow they'd called cursed could force them to see their own complicity. The church was fuller than it had been in months. Grace had expected resistance, had steeled herself for locked doors or Pastor Whitmore's refusal. Instead, she found the pews packed with faces she recognized. Farmers and shopkeepers, widows and soldiers, the working people of mercy who'd been watching and waiting for someone to speak the words they'd all been thinking. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, her laundry-worn hands folded in her lap. Beside her, old Samuel in his Sunday best, and Mr. Kowalski with his daughter, the girl whose father had died at Belleau Wood. 7 soldiers in worn uniforms, their faces scarred by more than just shrapnel. The families Daniel had tried to save, gathered like witnesses at a trial. Howard Mitchell sat in his usual spot, 3rd pew on the right, his face composed but his eyes darting nervously as he registered the unusual crowd. He wore his best suit, his banker's armor, confidence wrapped around him like a cloak. That confidence was about to be stripped away. Pastor Whitmore began the service with a hymn, his voice wavering as he sensed the tension thrumming through his congregation. When the song ended, he moved to begin his sermon, but Grace stood before he could speak. "Pastor Whitmore, I'd like to address the congregation." The church fell silent. Every eye turned to the woman in widow's black standing in the center aisle, her 5-year-old son holding her hand, her scarred husband rising to stand beside her. "Mrs. Reilly, this is highly irregular. So is burning down a house with a child inside." Grace's voice carried to the rafters. "So is sending men to die for profit. So is letting injustice hide behind respectability because we're all too comfortable to confront it." A ripple of shock moved through the congregation. Howard Mitchell started to stand, but James's hand fell on his shoulder, pushing him back down with the casual strength of a man who'd carried wounded soldiers through no man's land. "Sit down, Howard. You're going to want to hear this." Grace opened Daniel's journal. Her hands were steady now, her voice clear. "My husband, Daniel Hartwell, kept a record during the war, a record of what he saw, what he learned, what he tried to stop." She began to read, her voice filling the church with Daniel's words. She read about the enlistment bonuses, the foreclosures, the shell companies. She read the names of 12 men, and as she spoke each name, someone in the congregation gasped or sobbed or stood in recognition. She read about payments that vanished, about families destroyed, about a system designed to profit from patriotism. A man who profits from war while braver men die. That's not business. That's blood money. Grace closed the journal. Those were my husband's last written words. 3 days later, he died saving 23 men. One of them was James Reilly, who came home to find me preparing to marry the very man Daniel had died trying to expose. Howard Mitchell's face had gone from red to white to a sickly gray. He lurched to his feet. This is slander. Lies from a dead man who can't be questioned. A bitter widow's revenge fantasy. Then explain this. James held up a folder thick with documents. County records, foreclosure notices, property transfers. Every single transaction traced back to your shell company, Mitchell Holdings. Every single foreclosure corresponding to a soldier's deployment date. He opened the folder, papers spilling out. Want me to read the numbers out loud, Howard? Tell everyone here exactly how much you made off the backs of men fighting for their country? One of the soldiers stood, a man missing his left arm, his face deeply lined despite being barely 30. Daniel Hartwell saved my life at Belleau Wood, carried me 3 miles through German fire to reach a field hospital. I came home to find my farm sold, my wife living with her parents, my children asking why Daddy couldn't provide for them. His voice broke. I thought it was my fault. Thought I'd failed somehow. You're telling me it was Mitchell all along? We have proof, Grace said. Signed receipts from soldiers showing they made their payments. Bank records showing those payments never reached the proper accounts. Property sales showing Mitchell bought foreclosed land for pennies and sold it for fortunes. This is a witch hunt, Mitchell sputtered, looking wildly at Pastor Whitmore. Pastor, you can't allow this sacrilege in God's house. Actually, Howard, I think God's house is exactly where this needs to be heard. Pastor Whitmore's voice was cold. Grace had never heard him sound like that. Not weak or uncertain, but righteously angry. I lost my nephew at Chateau Thierry. His widow came to me 6 months ago, destitute, begging for help because the bank had taken everything. I told her to have faith, to trust in the Lord's plan. He looked at Mitchell with undisguised contempt. I should have been asking harder questions about the Lord's supposed banker. The congregation erupted. Voices overlapping, some shouting, some crying. The dam had broken. Years of whispered suspicions, of half-buried resentments, of grief that had nowhere to go, all of it flooding out at once. My brother died in France, someone called out. His wife got nothing while Mitchell got rich. He tried to foreclose on us last month, another voice added. Said we were behind, but we weren't. Not by a single payment. Mitchell backed toward the door, his composure shattered. You people are fools. You think this changes anything? I have lawyers. I have connections. You're just what, Howard? Grace stepped toward him, and despite being half his size, she seemed to tower over him. Just widows and farmers and soldiers. Just the people you've been bleeding dry for years? She held up the journal. You're right that this might not be enough to convict you in court. Your lawyers are good. Your connections run deep. But this? She gestured to the packed church. This is the court of public opinion, and you've just been found guilty. I'll ruin you, Mitchell hissed. I'll destroy what's left of your reputation. I'll make sure no one in this town ever... James stepped between them. You'll do nothing. Because if you so much as look at my wife wrong, if you come near my family, if you try one more scheme in this county, I'll make sure every newspaper from here to Oklahoma City knows exactly what you are. And more than that." His voice dropped to something dangerous. "I'll remember that I'm a man who survived Belleau Wood, who knows 100 ways to hurt someone without leaving marks. And I'll visit you one night when you least expect it." It wasn't a civilized threat. It wasn't what Grace would have chosen, but it was effective. Mitchell fled the church, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The silence that followed was profound. Then Mrs. Chen stood and began to clap. Slowly, others joined her, until the entire congregation was on their feet, applause thundering through the sanctuary. Grace felt James's arm circle her waist, felt Thomas press against her legs. And for the first time since a telegram had arrived 3 years ago, she felt the weight of grief ease just slightly. Daniel's work was finished. His family was safe. Justice, imperfect, incomplete, but real, had been served. But as the congregation filed out, as people pressed forward to shake Grace's hand and James's hand and promised to support the families Mitchell had ruined, Grace knew the real work was just beginning. Because exposing corruption was only the first step. Building something better from the ruins, that would take all of them, together. 6 months later, on a spring evening when the Oklahoma wheat fields turned gold under the setting sun, Grace Reilly sat on her front porch and watched her son teach James how to throw a baseball. The resolution they'd fought for wasn't perfect or Hollywood clean, but it was real, and sometimes real was enough. Howard Mitchell had left Mercy within a week of that Sunday service. The bank had transferred him to a branch in Kansas City, a quiet exile that satisfied no one but prevented open violence. The foreclosed properties couldn't all be returned. Some had been sold to legitimate buyers who'd done nothing wrong, but a fund had been established. Families received compensation. Widows got back pay their husbands had earned. It wasn't everything, but it was something. More importantly, the town had changed. The whispers about curses had stopped. Grace no longer walked through Mercy with her eyes down, shoulders hunched against judgment. People nodded, said hello, asked after Thomas, invited her and James to community gatherings. She'd gone from cursed widow to war hero's wife to simply Grace, a woman who'd stood up when it mattered. "You're thinking too hard," James said, lowering himself onto the porch step beside her. His legs still pained him, always would, but he moved easier now. The farm work had strengthened muscles that hospital beds had weakened. "I can hear your brain working from across the yard." Just remembering. Grace leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that had become natural over 6 months of learning each other. Remembering how terrified I was that day at the church, how certain I was that no one would listen. But they did. James's arm circled her waist. Because you gave them permission to speak truth they'd been holding in for years. That's what courage looks like, Grace. Not the absence of fear, but doing the right thing despite it. Thomas ran up to them, his face flushed with exertion and joy. He'd grown 2 inches in 6 months, his body filling out with regular meals and farm fresh air. "Papa James, did you see that throw? It went all the way to the fence." Papa James. The title had emerged naturally about 3 months in, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Grace had waited for it to hurt, for it to feel like a betrayal of Daniel's memory. Instead, it felt like healing. "I saw it, son. You've got a good arm. Another year and you'll be pitching for the town team." James ruffled the boy's hair. "Now go wash up. Supper's almost ready." As Thomas raced inside, Grace turned to look at James fully. In the golden evening light, his scars were less pronounced, or maybe she'd just learned to see past them to the man underneath. He'd never be the boy who'd enlisted with Daniel. That innocence was gone forever, but he'd become something better. A man who knew the cost of violence and chose gentleness. A man who'd seen the worst of humanity and still believed in building something good. "I love you," she said quietly. "I should have said it before now, but I needed to be sure. Needed to know it wasn't gratitude or obligation or—" He kissed her, cutting off her words. When they broke apart, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I know. I've known for months. Watched you falling in love with me the same way I fell in love with you. Slowly, carefully, like two people who'd been burned learning to trust fire again." He cupped her face. "We don't have to rush this, Grace. We have time." "Actually," she said, a small smile playing at her lips, "I was thinking we might not have as much time as we thought." His brow furrowed in confusion, then understanding dawned. "Grace, are you—" "About 8 weeks along, if my counting's right. Wasn't sure at first, but now—" She placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Now I'm certain." James's face cycled through shock, joy, fear, and finally settled on fierce protectiveness. "A baby. Our baby." Then more quietly, "Does it feel wrong? Because of Daniel?" Grace had wondered the same thing, had lain awake nights wrestling with the guilt of moving forward, of building a new life from the ashes of her old one. But she'd come to understand something essential. Honoring Daniel's memory didn't mean freezing in the moment of his death. It meant living the life he'd died to protect. "Daniel wanted me to be happy, wanted Thomas to have a family, wanted us to survive." She laced her fingers through James's. "This baby isn't a replacement or a betrayal. It's a continuation. Daniel saved you so you could save us, and now we're building something together, something that honors what he gave up." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and violet. Inside, Thomas was singing off-key while setting the table. In the barn, the chickens were settling for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird called out its evening song. This was what peace looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Not forgetting the past, but refusing to be imprisoned by it. "I never told you," James said softly, "what Daniel said at the very end. After he made me promise to look after you. After all the practical talk about money and the farm and raising Thomas." Grace tensed, not sure she wanted to hear this final piece of her husband's legacy. He said, "Jamie, if you fall in love with her, that's all right. That's what I want, actually. Because I know you'll love her the way she deserves, fully, honestly, without holding back." James's voice roughened. He knew Grace. Even dying, he knew what might happen, and he gave us his blessing. The tears came then, not from grief, but from a profound sense of completion. Daniel had known, had planned for this, had loved them both enough to imagine a future where they could be happy together. "He was a good man," Grace whispered. "The best I ever knew." James pulled her closer. "And we're going to make sure his son and this new baby grow up knowing exactly what kind of man their father was. The man who saved 23 soldiers, who documented injustice, who loved his family enough to die protecting not just them, but the principles they'd built their lives on." Thomas called from inside, announcing that supper was getting cold. They rose together, James offering his hand to help Grace up, the small gesture emblematic of their partnership. Two wounded people who'd learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant having the courage to begin again. As they walked into the warm, lamp-lit house, Grace looked back once at the darkening prairie. Somewhere out there, in a military cemetery in France, Daniel Hartwell rested alongside thousands of other men who'd given everything for a country that too often forgot them. But his legacy lived on, in the son who bore his name, in the journal that had exposed corruption, in the family that continued because of his sacrifice, and in the love that had survived death itself to bloom into something new. The promise had been kept. And somewhere, Grace liked to imagine, Daniel was smiling. To this day, people in Mercy County still talk about the widow who walked into church and brought down a banker with nothing but truth and a dead soldier's journal. And some say that on November mornings, when the wind blows just right, you can hear three men's laughter echoing across the wheat fields. A hero, a survivor, and the friend who kept his word. If this story moved you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And subscribe, because every week we bring you true stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when it mattered most.